Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Shrink Think. This is a show for therapists on common errors in the treatment of survivors of narcissistic and psychopathic abuse, which we call pathological love relationships. This show is sponsored by the Association for MPD and Psychopathy Survivor Treatment at survivortreatment.com. And I am your co-host, Chelli Pumphrey. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I am the author of Insight is 2020, How to Trust Yourself to Protect Yourself from Narcissistic Abuse and Toxic Relationships. And here today, I am joined by our co-host and leader, Sandra Brown. Hello, Sandra.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Sandra Brown, president at the association and a director over at the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction, and the author of the book Women Who Love Psychopaths and the book How to Spot a Dangerous Thief.
Yes, so many good things you've put out to the world. So today we are here and we're going to be talking about one of the consistently missed elements in this population's treatment, which we call dual dysregulation. And, one of the things that I think is important to mention about why this is one of the important topics here is that Sandra did what we call the Finding Competent Care study, where survivors were surveyed, and they did an in-depth look at what survivors were experiencing in treatment, and what we got was a lot of information about where the treatment failures were coming from, what survivors were experiencing, what wasn't working. And overall, Sandra, you can also, share more details about this, but overall, this study really showed that survivors are being severely misunderstood, and the very unique and atypical kind of trauma that they experience was being completely overlooked, and maybe sometimes not even being seen as trauma because of the unique aspect to it. So, Sandra, if you want to kind of share more, would love to hear more about this.
Well, we did the Finding Competent Care study because of hundreds of survivors. I think over 300 survivors took that study that we did because there was such widespread treatment failure in the population. And after we did the study, we're always studying and learning and with this new field and theory. That information from what we call the FCC study, Finding Competent Care study, also piggybacked with other information and data that I was working on to understand why their trauma and their treatment and their survivor profile was often different than other forms of victimization, especially in comparison to domestic violence survivors, and why traditional treatment wasn't working, to get to the bottom of all this treatment failure that was going on. So it felt sort of like putting together, a puzzle by starting with the symptoms. 100% of them had that really differentiated them in treatment from other types of survivors, and that symptom was cognitive dissonance.
Right. And for listeners who don't understand cognitive dissonance, or CD for short, and you can also go back and look at our previous show where we did a deep dive into this. But basically, cognitive dissonance is the number one treatment or the number one trauma symptom that you will see in these survivors. And, for most of us who are therapists, we know of cognitive dissonance as a basic conflict of two beliefs that are in opposition with each other, two truths that are in opposition with each other. But the CD that we see in survivors is much more persistent and chronic, and it actually leads to very debilitating trauma for the survivors. And generally speaking, what the CD looks like is, when you have the survivors going kind of in this looped thinking of, 1 minute they're fantasizing and thinking of all the wonderful things they've experienced in their partner, and the next minute they're talking about all the trauma that they've experienced, and they kind of get stuck in this, it's like they're having a relationship with two different people, and it's extremely paralyzing for them, and explains why many of them get stuck for years. So that's kind of just some background on that. So going back to dual dysregulation, Sandra, how did you come to understand this dual dysregulation?
Yeah, and just if people are just tuning in now on this, go back and listen to the one we did on cognitive dissonance, where we go from cognitive dissonance a little bit into this issue about dual dysregulation. So it might make it a little easier to understand. When I began trying to figure out what their version of the symptom of CD was, it just led to more questions. I just felt like I was going down this dark tunnel for years. I'd like to say I woke up one day and just had this inspiration. It all came to me, but it took a long time to dig it out. And I think this is how when you are on to some real science theory, and not just some of the superficial answers that we see out there. That is really forms of faux psychology. And it's when all the elements of the condition are connected, and when elements support each other, and that you can't remove one of the elements without it making the whole chain of theory collapse. So it's very much, like putting together a puzzle, figuring out how cognitive dissonance and dual dysregulation were connected. And you just figure it out one piece at a time, which simply presents another question to the puzzle until it really truly starts to come together.
Right. So there had to have been pieces that weren't fitting from other models, like domestic violence or trauma, right?
Right. That was the problem. And so let's talk about that a minute, because it's why this, in my mind, has or needs to develop into a specialization in treatment and training, because there are pieces of its theory that are different than what we have been taught. And that's what hung me up for so long in figuring this out, which contributed to why we are seeing treatment failure, because what we were using was not a complete theory for this population. And it's why what we are seeing on the internet by experts is, again, not related to what has been found out about this population. So I think everyone starts out like I did, using what we were taught in domestic violence and in just basic trauma 101 types treatment and approaches, and trying methods that works in other victimizational populations, like coaching or even group therapy. But those methods were not effective for this population, and they weren't the biggest issue is they weren't created for survivors who have cognitive dissonance, who have trauma and cognitive dissonance. And those two conditions, serious hyperaroused conditions of trauma and CD is what produces dual dysregulation. And so their unique symptoms produce the need for unique methods. And their unique symptom is cognitive dissonance and what CD does to them. And so, and to their brain, to their central nervous system. You know, we talked about this in the last video, ultimately what it does to their executive functioning system, which all of it, of course, affects their recovery. And so we can't expect effective recovery if we aren't treating their unique symptoms with methods that work for that symptom. I mean, that's not rocket science, but it's also what hasn't been happening here.
Right.
And so while this is a form of abuse, the methods in domestic violence is not the totality of what they have going on. And while this is, you know, a form of trauma, we've talked about it as a form of trauma, the methods that we use in trauma, again, is not the totality of what they have going on either. And that they have an added dimension.
And that added dimension is what having cognitive dissonance does to them and dual dysregulation. Is that correct?
Correct. And 100% of survivors of PLRs, you know, have cognitive dissonance. That was one of the studies that we did. I've never met a survivor of a pathological relationship who didn't have cognitive dissonance.
Right.
And so in that show that we did on CD, we talked about why pathological relationships organically produce dissonance, which is why it's seen in all survivors. And something that shows up as a symptom in 100% of the population is a clue right there about the unique aspects of that population and what should be at the top of our treatment list. And so, and at the top is this, you know, symptom of cognitive dissonance and what it is doing to their central nervous system, their brain, and their skills that they need to recover. And so we think of dual dysregulation as a byproduct of their CD and their trauma. And it is one of the main things we focus on in this type of trauma survivor population. And is one of the first things that we jump in and work with if we are doing trauma treatment effectively, is that we know this from just regular trauma treatment, that's what we do in the beginning of trauma treatment, is that we work with a survivor's dysregulated system, right? I mean, that's like
Right. Yeah, right. In trauma, we know that the central nervous system becomes hyper or hypoaroused, which produces a lot of the symptoms that trauma treatment is supposed to treat.
right. And
Yeah.
and so from our trauma study, we found that up to 75% of these survivors have trauma disorders. And so we know from the get-go, they likely have a dysregulated central nervous system that needs work. And then they also have this other symptom in 100% of them, cognitive dissonance, which produces symptoms too, except that these symptoms are a cognitive dysregulation.
Right. And that's what we see with them being all over the place, with not being able to kind of hold on to one perception of the partner. They love them, they loathe them, they want, they don't want, and it changes moment to moment. And it really is crazy making.
Right. And, any kind of dysregulation, whether it's emotional dysregulation and trauma or cognitive dysregulation and cognitive dissonance, is essentially what we are talking about is destabilization. It's a haywire, if you will, internal process. And we have only focused on, it seems, in treatment, if we are lucky, about focusing on regulating their emotional dysregulation and trauma, hoping that it would stabilize the cognitive oriented dysregulation in cognitive dissonance. And the problem is that what unites both types of dysregulation is the memories of the two personas, the Jekyll and the Hyde, and that memory ends up being like the primary trigger. And so housed within their memory is not only the emotions, for instance, of the bad Mr. Hyde, it is also the good Dr. Jekyll. And so anytime we are dealing with dysregulation, we are dealing with the unresolved cognitive dissonance of Jekyll and Hyde. All of their memories contain two sides, both sides, and both sides are capable of bringing both the cognitive dysregulation and cognitive dissonance, but also the emotions that go with it and emotional dysregulation within their trauma.
Wow. So you're saying that emotional dysregulation of trauma can set off the cognitive dysregulation, the big word, cognitive dysregulation, boy, of cognitive dissonance. So both are happening at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. Because they are all connected to memory, and memory is the trigger. They don't get to compartmentalize, I'm thinking of one incident and I'm going to put my emotions over here and I'm going to put the cognitive dissonance over there. So what was unrealized is that cognitive dissonance causes, and we talked about this in the last show, this hyper neural activity that can even be seen in fMRIs, and it becomes more than just a conflict about loving and loathing or wanting and not wanting. It actually sets off a neuro firestorm that over time, like trauma, changes how poorly the brain works and affects, for instance, their decision making, rationale, judgment, concentration. We see that a lot in the survivors, as symptoms. So if they are talking about a memory in treatment, for instance, or even just thinking about a memory, the memory is not separated, of course, from the conflicted thinking about both sides of the partners. It is all part of their memories. So they think about a memory, they have the emotion, they remember, and are conflicted about both sides of the partner and wanting or not wanting. And so without treatment, the memory can set off the fight, flight, freeze chemical bomb, as we call it. But it also sets off the cognitive dissonance because both are forms of dysregulation.
Right. So this explains why their neurocognitive condition is so severe. What I've noticed is, these survivors will come in, and depending on how long or how severe the relationship has been, they can be completely impacted, with, I mean, you've kind of mentioned some of this, but, really struggling to function in their day to day life. They may come in looking like kind of deer in the headlights, where they're really hypo aroused or hyper aroused and they're constantly in like a fight or flight state. But I see, they have a difficult time making decisions, doing more analytical, kind of rational type, higher level, executive functioning type of thinking. Um, and their memory is poor, their emotional regulation is really shot. I mean, there's
Right.
so much more to what's going on than what we might actually, I mean, I think we miss the fact that a lot of that is connected to this type of trauma.
Right. And that's what made me, take a closer look, is that their neuro condition is far worse
Right.
than survivors who have trauma only. And, that can be pretty bad trauma. Uh, who would think that we would say there's something worse than trauma? Uh,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
but that's in fact what had me take a closer look. So their brain and central nervous system is set off in two ways. That's why we call it dual. It's set off in fight and flight, or through cognitive dissonance, which if CD is set off first, it can set off fight or flight. If fight and flight is set off first, it can set off cognitive dissonance,
Right.
because you're dealing with the same memory that houses both trauma and CD reactions.
Right. Well, and I want to add something to that. Like, one of the things that I think happens with therapists is, there's kind of this urgency to try to help them look at getting out of this relationship. And then you're missing the cognitive dissonance that's keeping them stuck in the first place. But it also, when you have that impact to the executive functioning, that's where you need to be able to think rationally and analyze, like, how do I leave this relationship?
Right.
What things do I need to think about to safely leave, or
Right.
to get my finances in order, or to be safe, right? And so I think it's, you have to kind of think about that even going to that more kind of just planning analytical level to leave a relationship can be impossible if this CD isn't being treated. So,
Right. They
right,
don't have the bandwidth
right,
to um, be able to think in those terms and execute. And the last thing you want to do is have a faulty exit. That's when
right,
they get killed. And
right.
that there's got to be some neuro work that happens up front for them to
Mhm.
get to the point of being able to do that. And that's, again, I think, where some of this work, some of the ways that we were taught back in the day with domestic violence protocols, where sometimes this work is different because their neurocognition is far worse than trauma only survivors. And there's some pre-work that has to be done for them to even get to that point of being able to make an exit plan.
Right. So, Sandra, what does this mean for treatment?
Well, it's why I said DV 101, or even, trauma 101, is not specific enough for what is going on with them. Their treatment issue, get anywhere at all without constantly setting off their central nervous system in treatment, has to deal with that issue that we were just talking about dealing with this issue about dysregulation. So if they don't have dysregulation skills, both in emotional, the trauma, dysregulation skills, and in cognitive, dysregulation skills with cognitive dissonance. As soon as you start talking about the narrative, you have set off this dual dysregulation, and now nothing effective is going to happen in treatment. You spend the rest of treatment trying to regulate it. And in our FCC study, it's why survivors said they quit treatment. It was because their dysregulation got worse, and now we know why. Now we understand that. So you spend, you know, the rest of the session trying to get them re-regulated. And so this is why in our ebook we just published recently called, let's see, Common Errors in Treating and Coaching. We said that coaching and therapy can't possibly, for instance, be effective until they have gone through, you know, serious stabilization using skill building for this dual dysregulation, or else, you know, we're just worsening their condition.
Right. Well, this has been so enlightening. Thank you for sharing all of you know, your expertise in this. And so, if those of you who've been watching find this as enlightening as I do, please check us out at survivortreatment.com, where you could find out more information about this and the in-depth training and certification that Sandra's developed. So thank you again for being here today.
Thanks, everybody.